Hey everyone, ahlan wa sahlan fikum. Today I want to talk about my 8 language learning do's and don'ts. It seems my approach to language learning is pretty different from what I see others recommending online, so I'm curious to know your thoughts. In that vein, today's question is, what do you think is the biggest challenge you face regarding language learning? As for me, it's definitely amassing vocabulary. Even though I've gotten to the point where I can converse pretty easily in Armenian, I usually have to stop abruptly to look up terms I don't know. Since I live in Armenia and I can use the language all the time, I actually got kind of lazy about looking at my notes. That's how I got to the point where I can easily open conversation, but then I'm like, Inch? Anyway, here are my 8 language learning do's and don'ts. First, don't learn irrelevant things. Decide what is relevant to you. Way too many language learning materials start off by teaching you a bunch of color words and the names of animals and stuff that you will literally never use, unless you're a painter or you're going to the zoo. I say if you're using any kind of textbook-like resource, ditch the vocabulary list and make your own, choosing the types of words that are actually interesting or useful to you particularly. Then focus your energy on that. In my case, I always end up learning a lot of language-related jargon that ordinary people certainly wouldn't need, but that I personally like to know just because it's something that I really talk about a lot. 2. Do take notes, especially digitally. You all know about my Palestinian Arabic lexicon spreadsheet. When I learn a new language, I immediately start writing down and recording every new word I learn. The purpose of this is not actually to learn these words on the spot or even to memorize them later using stuff like flashcards or anything like that, but rather to have a way to go back to any word I've previously encountered when I'm actually trying to recall that word and use it in a new context again. Speaking of which, don't memorize, use. This one may seem a little bit controversial, but honestly, don't bother memorizing anything at all. That's why I rarely talk about flashcard applications or anything like that in my resource videos. I think there's a time and a place for them, but most people over-rely on them to study. If anything, I think of them more as portable notes that you can use to quickly remind yourself of a word. But for that matter, why not just have a proper digital notebook? At the end of the day, I think we all know the best way to learn a word isn't through memorization, but by actually using it. Yet realistically, you can't control what kinds of words will be necessary in a given situation, which is why you sort of need to go with the flow. Here's how it works for me. I come across a useful word and I write it down. I don't bother memorizing it per se, but instead, I focus my time on recording more and more words as I run into them. Then, I find myself in a situation where I need a certain key word. If I don't know it at all, I'll find it and write it down. If I have encountered it before, I try to remember it, and if I succeed, well, then that's great. But if not, then I can look it up in my notes and then immediately get a chance to use it on the spot, and that will really reinforce it for next time. But hey, maybe you'll never need that word again. By focusing on what you need when you need it, you pretty much guarantee that you'll only be investing your limited time and energy into the words that you'll actually encounter and use most frequently. 4. Do make mistakes. There are different types of mistakes you can make while trying to speak a foreign language, but the one I'm referring to is when you have no idea how you're supposed to even say a certain type of phrase, and so you just kind of guess, and obviously it comes out making no sense. Well, that's perfect, but just make sure that you make note of what you were trying to say and try to find out later how that type of structure actually works in the language. In other words, know what you don't know. 5. Don't translate, imitate. Pretty much no matter what language you're trying to learn, although this is especially true for spoken Arabic, the things people actually say in a normal conversation may seem to fly completely in the face of everything you supposedly learned about the language. Until you can figure out why they're saying it like this and not like that, don't get hung up on the fact that it doesn't immediately make sense, just copy it and do exactly as they do. For instance, maybe you learned that the present tense of sekan would be bioskon, but everyone is asking you when sekan. You may want to try to figure out later what's going on here, but your immediate response should just be to just roll with it and copy it. As it turns out, sekan is an active participle, which is a very common type of word that doesn't actually have a single fixed use, so there's really no better way to learn when and how to use it than by just copying it when and how others use it. 6. Do pronounce things correctly. Pronunciation is extremely important, and I don't want to hear any excuses. What people seem to completely ignore about practicing pronunciation is that it isn't just about sounding authentic, it's about practicing your listening skills too. After all, if you can pronounce a sound, that obviously means that you know what it's supposed to sound like. And that means that when you hear it, you're able to identify it. In other words, practicing your own pronunciation is really a form of listening practice by preparing yourself to distinguish the unfamiliar sounds of a language. Put differently, having bad pronunciation doesn't just mean you may be misunderstood, it means you risk misunderstanding as well, if you can't tell the difference between similar sounds. 7. Do learn the script. First of all, the relationship between a language and its script is different for every language, so the reasons to learn the script will be different as well. For some languages, this may not be important at all, but for Arabic, it's extremely important. The Arabic script is extremely useful and efficient at representing the specific morphology of Arabic, so even if it's tough at first to read something without the short vowels, the reason it's possible to do so at all is due to the strong patterning of Arabic words. So struggling with the script will push you to learn those patterns. You won't just become good at reading, but you'll actually gain a much better grasp of how the language works, and you'll be able to recognize not just specific words, but also their roots, the patterns they go in, and the meanings of those roots and patterns. Another way to think about it is that learning to read isn't step 1 and then you move on. Rather, it's part of the entire process of learning Arabic. It's a challenge, but it's an aid as well. 8. Do read, especially out loud. Another reason I think reading is not just important, but really useful, even for so-called spoken Arabic, is that it goes hand in hand with your pronunciation. If you read out loud, you can practice your pronunciation, especially if you have a point of reference. And that's why I've been making those annotated transcripts. There's really a million ways you can use them. Practice your listening by watching the video, then checking the terms you weren't able to pick up. Practice your reading and pronunciation by reading out loud first, then comparing that to how it's said in the video. And of course, learn new vocabulary in the process. So those were my 8 language learning do's and don'ts. If I had to summarize, I would say my approach tries to account for visual learning through reading and auditory learning through pronunciation, while privileging spontaneity as a way of actually guiding what you should learn, rather than determining what you should learn first and then just hoping it'll be useful one day. I'm curious to know if any of these ideas are new to you, or if it goes against anything you've heard from others. What are some of your own language learning do's and don'ts? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next time.